All right. So welcome back or welcome to our mindfulness group. So this is our second week together. If you're new here, welcome. We're happy to have you. And I'm hoping that this is going to be helpful and informative for you. I'm happy to be here again today. And so for any of you who have missed last session, my name is Ashlee. I'm a counseling therapist with Breelove Counselling, who has partnered with the Canadian Mental Health Association of New Brunswick to offer you this group. We are a trauma-informed integrative practice that focuses on community and private partnerships. And our specialties range from general mental health, art therapy, adversities, trauma, nutritional psychology, and all for individuals age 18 and older. So welcome back. It's great to have you all here again today. So before we kind of jump into our topic today, I just wanted to check in for anyone who was here last time on how our homework went for last week. And if you wanted to share, if anyone wanted to share a mindful moment that they had this week or this past week. And even if you weren't here last week, if you can reflect on what kind of a mindful moment did you experience this past week. I know for myself, I went for a nice little walk and I was very mindful of the different sounds that I was hearing. So the birds there was a little stream and I would stop and kind of really I love that sound, the sound of running water. So kind of stopping and taking a nice deep breath and really reflecting on that sound and just really appreciating that moment. So little things like that. Tried the Insight Timer app. Did anyone else try the app and find it successful and did they enjoy using it? Out for a walk, yeah, and the birds chirping, sun on the face, yeah. The weather's been so beautiful lately too, so that definitely makes it easier to be more mindful and to appreciate the outdoors, I can imagine. Walking more, taking time to enjoy coffee breaks, absolutely. Morning coffee, yes. Well, I'm going to mindfully enjoy my morning coffee as well with you guys. Interesting that someone mentioned that their issue of forgetfulness was not as noticeable as before by practicing mindfulness, which is great because I think then that kind of gives you an idea that maybe the forgetfulness that you were experiencing wasn't necessarily because you're forgetful and your brain isn't working. It's just the fact that your brain is busy and you're not always in the present moment. So that's great that you experienced that and noticed that for the first time. It sounds like a lot of people went for walks. I think that's great and a great option for those who, are stuck inside and we're all quarantining together. So getting outside and being able to enjoy nature in little ways is great. Wow. I love the experience of watching sugar melt into the coffee and how it changed colors and really watching that process happen. That's something similar to that is when I pour some cream in my coffee or some milk and watching it swirl around. I really love that. Really love that. And again, it's something that we do every day, right? We always are making our coffee, putting our milk or cream in, putting our sugar in, and we never notice how it really looks or how we experience that. Ooh, the Stop, Breathe, and Think app. I've never heard of that one before. I'd love to hear your feedback if you enjoyed it and if it was helpful. Ooh, someone noticed that they slept better, which is great. That's a great benefit of mindfulness. Again, remember when our minds are really busy, then it's harder to rest and it's harder to relax because our bodies are reflecting what our mind is doing. So when our mind is really busy, our body is kind of feeling more jittery and on edge. So it's great that being able to calm your mind also helped you calm your body. Awesome. It's so wonderful to hear all of the moments that you had this week. It's great to reflect on those things, and it gives everyone else some ideas too of some different options that they can maybe try as well. I also maybe wanted to touch on the fact that, maybe sometime this week, as much as we can appreciate and congratulate ourselves on the good things that we did, maybe there were some moments that we that weren't so great, or that we noticed ourselves not being mindful, and you caught yourself maybe being mindless. I know for myself, I definitely caught myself being not mindful a few times, and I caught myself getting stuck in that cycle of kind of overthinking on a situation and replaying it in my head over and over, and just being stuck in that kind of icky place. So I definitely can reflect on that. I still struggle with not being mindful, and especially right now with everything going on, it is hard to stay present and to not let ourselves get into that cycle in our head. So even if you did have moments this week where you did catch yourself being mindless or not being mindful and getting stuck in your head, but you were still aware of it, you noticed it, I just want to say, like, that's still mindfulness, right? Even if you can't really appreciate, or you got frustrated with yourself in that moment, that you're like, oh, I can't believe I'm still getting stuck in that cycle. It's still mindful to notice that and develop an awareness of it. This is a skill, and it's not going to happen overnight where you just become super mindful all the time. It's something that needs practice. So the fact that you were able to notice when you weren't being mindful shows that you're developing that skill. You're developing an awareness of your attention, and that is still progress, right? You're still, even if you found yourself frustrated, you're still working on a skill, and you're still showing that even when you're being mindless, you're also being mindful in the fact that you can catch yourself and be aware of it. So it's still developing a skill. It's still working through it. And I just want to commend anyone, even if you weren't feeling like you did a lot of progress, or you weren't feeling very positive about the fact that you were able to practice certain things, you definitely still were able, you're still working on it, and it's going to happen, and it's going to take time. Right. And I apologize to anyone, or I feel for you, for anyone who's going through a hard time right now. And I guess maybe this session in particular might be really great for us all, because this, again, leads nicely into what our topic is today, which is when it's hard to be mindful, when we're having a hard time, and when difficult things are happening around us or for us, it can be really hard to stay mindful and stay in the moment. So at some point in our lives, we've all had to cope with overwhelming feelings, overwhelming experiences, and at times painful experiences too. And I'm sure our thoughts are with everyone who's, Mary in particular, our thoughts are with you and your dad. And again, this, even COVID in general, despite anything else, is an overwhelming and painful experience for everybody. There's losses that are happening around us, and we don't really know what's going on. Everything that happened in Nova Scotia this past weekend too, it's just, there's a lot of things going on that are really overwhelming, really hard to understand, and they're very painful experiences. And pain and overwhelming feelings can be physical. They can be simple things like a bee sting, or maybe even a broken bone. But it can also be an emotional thing. So a feeling of being unsafe, feeling of sadness or anger. So in both cases, whether it's a physical pain or an emotional pain, they're both unavoidable and unpredictable. And that's what makes them so difficult to deal with, that unpredictability. And you can't always anticipate when, say, a bee sting, you can't anticipate when a bee sting is going to happen, right? Or when something is going to make you upset, or something happens around us to the people that we love, then it's an unexpected experience. But all you can do often, and sometimes the best that we can do in those moments, is to use coping skills that we have and hope that they work. But for some people, emotional and physical pain feels way more intense and occurs way more frequently than it does for other people. And that's just the nature of the beast. And their distress comes on way more quickly, and it feels way more overwhelming. Almost, we talked about last week, that tidal wave, right? That kind of overwhelming, all of a sudden feeling where that comes on. So often these situations feel like they're never going to end, and the people experiencing them, we don't know how to cope with the severity of our emotions, because it's unpredictable. It kind of rocks us and shakes our foundation, and it's hard to deal with things, especially right now, when we're kind of all stuck at home, and there's lots of regulations on things, and we're not able to see the people that we would, or cope in the ways that we might have before. So in this event, and for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to call all of these things emotional distress. So people who struggle with overwhelming emotions often deal with their pain in some unhealthy ways that may be unsuccessful in decreasing their distress, because they don't know what else to do. And this is understandable, right? Because how can we do something that we've never been taught or that we've never been shown to do? When a person is in emotional pain, it's really hard to be rational. And this is actually a topic that we'll get to in a couple weeks, I think. But your brain doesn't allow for rational thought when it's really overwhelmed and we're experiencing emotions. So it's really hard to be rational and to think of a good solution when we're in emotional pain. So that makes it's almost like our brain is working against us in those senses. And when we are feeling really overwhelmed, it is very difficult to bring us back down to a rational spot where we can think of solutions and come up with a healthy coping style. It's often way easier to deal with our pain through coping strategies like watching Netflix, scrolling through social media, eating, snacking, drinking, smoking. These are all things that are easily accessible to us, and they provide that kind of quick, instant relief, I guess, in a sense. And rather than when you practice sort of mindfulness skills or any of the other coping mechanisms, it might not be that instant gratification. It might take a minute for it to settle in. So it's not and it requires a lot of effort on our part as well. So that's why it's harder to decide to go towards those things. And we tend to do those unhelpful coping strategies. So many of the coping strategies used by people that experience overwhelming emotions really only end up making those problems more difficult, or they only temporarily soothe, but they don't actually help in the long run. And they can actually have unhelpful effects, right? So drinking and smoking, maybe overeating and scrolling through social media, all of those can have their downfalls, and all of those can affect us in negative ways or become barriers in our lives or limit us in some way. Most of our coping skills have been taught to us by an early age. And although they might have been helpful in the past, and maybe when we were younger, they might have been helpful, if they've been left unchallenged, if they've been left without thought about it and without reflection, this can also lead to unhelpful forms of, when we experience an overwhelming emotion, rather than being able to pause and to reflect on it and to react or to respond, we actually react. So the difference between react and respond, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with that, but when we respond, we're responding to a situation consciously and intentionally, and we've had time to think about it, and we're not just kind of reacting based on emotion and based on that overwhelm. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And again, I think this topic, it sounds like it's quite relevant to a few of us today in terms of that overwhelming emotion that's coming up, and maybe how we can deal with them and work through it a little bit more healthily than we might have in the past. So I guess I'm curious. I'm going to ask the group, is it possible, one sec, there we go. Is it possible to be certain about everything in life? No. Okay. No. And how is needing certainty in our lives? Because I think most of us can reflect on the fact that, even though we know that nothing is certain in life, and I think we've all heard that quote, that the only certainty in life is that it is uncertain. How is needing certainty? Because we do need it. And I think that's why we feel anxiety. That's why we feel worried. That's why we think about the future and we plan ahead and we try to anticipate things, right? Because as human beings, we appreciate certainty and we appreciate the stability of being able to plan ahead. But again, if nothing is certain, then planning ahead and worrying about the future or thinking about these things often can lead to a lot of anxiety and feelings that we don't want. So how is needing certainty in life helpful versus unhelpful? Are there good things about needing certainty, and are there bad things about needing certainty? So something that comes to mind for me is that certainty, like I mentioned earlier, helps us plan and think ahead for the future, right? It helps us be able to anticipate, right? And being a planner, it is difficult to not know for certain what's going to happen, and it's hard to come to terms with the fact that, you know, one of the constants in our life is that everything is uncertain. Things can happen on a dime, right? We never really know what's going to happen day to day. We can plan our best and kind of schedule things in, but unexpected things happen all the time, and it is really difficult to deal with those things. So again, wanting certainty and struggle and dealing with that can be a way to help us plan for the future. It helps us anticipate what to expect, and it helps us feel a sense of stability, I guess, or a sense of certainty. But I wonder if, yeah, right, like if you something doesn't go your way and doesn't go the way you expected, you may not know how to respond because it's going to throw you off. And again, that goes back to that topic of what we talked about last time, is when if we're constantly in our heads and not being in the present moment, and we're two steps ahead of ourselves all the time, so wanting that certainty, then of course we're not going to be able to respond when something doesn't go our way, because we're already like two steps down the track rather than being in the moment and experiencing it for what it is. So it does throw you off, and it makes it really hard to be flexible in that moment and to actually respond to it intentionally rather than just react because it's not going our way. So that lack of control, yeah, can be really overwhelming. I think something that is unhelpful about needing certainty is that it creates fear, and it creates that lack of flexibility when things do go wrong. So when we try and always anticipate what's happening next, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it has a limit, right? Sometimes it's unhelpful as well. But it does create fear. It creates worry. It creates that lack of flexibility and the inability to respond to new situations or to what's thrown at you day to day, versus being stuck into that narrow-minded and kind of already two steps ahead of ourselves kind of line of thinking. So this is kind of what the paradox is that exists in relation to our emotions and how we deal with them, right? When it makes a lot of sense that we always try and get away from the feelings that we feel that are unpleasant. So again, by wanting certainty, we are planning ahead. We're doing the best that we can to know what to expect. But then that can sometimes often lead to us being disappointed. It can lead to feelings of being out of control, and it can really throw you off if you've planned so deeply for one certain result and it doesn't happen the way that we want it to, and that can lead to overwhelming feelings. So this strategy of trying to avoid our feelings by planning ahead, or trying to avoid the way that we feel by needing certainty, it can really have a way of making us feel uncomfortable. It works for other things, right? When the strategy of avoidance or of trying to plan ahead or to anticipate really does work for other things. Things like when we're cold or hot, or we're in pain, or we're hungry, we eat regularly to avoid being hungry. We take layers off, or we use blankets when we're hot or cold. We actively avoid situations when we can that might cause us pain, and when we do feel pain, we have ways of dealing with it. So we know when we can generally avoid physical distress, but when we apply these same strategies to our emotions, it does seem to backfire. And so this is the paradox of the nature of our emotional distress. So when we try and avoid our emotions, that actually doesn't help us or serve us in any way. So the more that we fear, and the more that we struggle with and try to avoid any form of distress, generally the worse the distress gets. So our fear and avoidance of distress actually magnifies the emotion, and it actually makes it bigger for us. And I think that's oftentimes a misconception, right? When we avoid, it's because we're like, well, if I allow myself to feel this, and I allow myself to feel that big emotion, then if I open those doors, I'm not going to be able to shut them, and I'm going to be so overwhelmed, and I'm not going to be able to deal with it. But in reality, when we acknowledge our feelings and we validate ourselves for feeling that way, that can actually lessen the way how distressing it feels. So our fear and avoidance of distress, like I said, magnifies that emotion. And unlike being cold or hot or hungry, there isn't always a simple solution or quick solution to our emotional distress, like we talked about earlier, which is why we tend to go to unhelpful coping mechanisms. So something kind of like a metaphor or an image that we can talk about is, imagine that your emotional distress is kind of like a big body of water that's kind of blocking your path. If you can recognize that this puddle, that this body of water is your emotional distress, so it's that all those overwhelming feelings that you're having, and it's not something that we have to fear or something to run away from, then you just have a puddle of water, right? It's not a bad thing. It is what it is. It's a puddle of water. And eventually, if you wait and if you're calm and practiced, it'll dry up enough that you can jump over it. But on the other hand, and I know some of it, when I think of this metaphor, I'm like, well, why wouldn't you just walk through it if we know that it's safe and it's not to be feared? But when we walk through it and we kind of splash our way around and we jar up all those feelings, that can make it worse. So if we splash through it as a way to avoid it and just kind of get through it as quick as we can, that actually, and try to escape from it, by doing this, you could fall into it a little bit more. It's going to jostle more things. You can add more water to the puddle through unhelpful coping skills, if you want to follow that metaphor too. And soon enough, again, we're faced with a bigger problem than we were before. So the bigger the pond, the harder it is to find our way through it. And therefore we might feel stuck or unable to move forward. I prefer, I think, the metaphor of a pressure cooker. So our emotional distress is like a pressure cooker. And the more we try and avoid our emotions, and the more we try to use unhelpful coping mechanisms or strategies to deal with those overwhelming feelings, the more pressure that builds and builds and builds in that pressure cooker. And we know that with a pressure cooker, we need to release that pressure somehow. And by recognizing our feelings, acknowledging them, and working through them with healthy coping skills, these are all ways that we can work on releasing that pressure and releasing some of that overwhelm that we feel. But when we try and push it down and when we try and avoid it, it actually ends up creating more pressure. And eventually that's going to blow up in a way that maybe we don't want. And maybe it will blow up in a way that at something very minor that normally wouldn't bother you, but because you've been sitting with this distress all day, it's too much, and it's the straw that broke the camel's back. So I have on our screen here a list of common coping strategies used by people that tend to be dealing with overwhelming feelings. So just like we did last week, keep a tally of the things that you have done or do, and we'll kind of talk about this in a little bit. So you spend a great deal of time thinking about past pains, mistakes, and problems. You get anxious worrying about possible future pains, mistakes, and problems. You isolate yourself from other people to avoid distressing situations. You make yourself feel numb with alcohol or drugs. You take your feelings out on other people by getting excessively angry at them or trying to control them. You engage in dangerous behaviors like cutting, hitting, picking at, or burning yourself, or pulling at your own hair. You engage in unsafe sexual activities such as having sex with strangers or frequent unprotected sex. You avoid dealing with the cause of your problems, such as an abusive or dysfunctional relationship. You use food to punish or control yourself by eating too much, not eating at all, or by throwing up what you eat. You attempt suicide or engage in high-risk activities like reckless driving or taking dangerous amounts of alcohol or drugs. You avoid pleasant activities such as social events and exercise, maybe because you don't think that you deserve to feel better. And lastly, you surrender to your pain and resign yourself to living a miserable and unfulfilling life. So I'd be curious to see how many of these people identify with, and if any. So all of these coping strategies are pretty common, and we tend to do one or many of these things, 7 of them. Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of our members today are do quite a few of these things, right? And all of these strategies, even though again we do them because we hope to feel better and we do them to cope, they actually end up leading us to even deeper emotional pain, because these strategies again only cause us temporary relief, but they end up creating other issues maybe in our lives, right? Especially maybe the one about taking out our feelings, right? So when we are unable to cope with our own feelings on our own and we end up taking that out on other people, that creates tension in our relationships, and that can be hard to overcome and cause issues over time. Same with overeating or undereating, right? That can have physical issues. Spending a great time thinking about our past pains and mistakes, that can cause a lot of negative self-talk, which might lead to more distress. So there's these things, again, in the moment, they feel like the only way to deal and the only way to cope with the things that we're going through. But they actually cause more suffering in the long run, because these are only temporary solutions for our problems. And again, I think some of the, in particular, some of the coping strategies, actually most of them, with a little mindfulness, and kind of practicing the strategies that we went over last week, might help us in being able to navigate dealing with these and maybe coping in a new way. So taking out our feelings on others, right? Being mindful of the fact that we're feeling overwhelmed, and rather than again pushing it down and avoiding it, if we're mindful and able to acknowledge it and have an awareness of it, then we're able to be responding intentionally rather than having that pressure cooker feeling and then all of a sudden it blows up and we're just taking it out on other people. Same thing with thinking about past pains and mistakes and problems. If we're able to be mindful of that and notice when we're getting stuck into that loop, then we can stop, we can redirect our attention, and we can stop that cycle of again, adding to the pressure cooker and adding to that emotional distress that we feel when we kind of come up against all these pains and mistakes and problems. So it's definitely interesting to go through these and to maybe recognize where we might be coping in ways that might not be as helpful, and maybe we've never really thought about that before. So I hope that was helpful to go through. So how does our emotional distress develop? So this is likely a combination of biological factors, emotional factors, environmental factors that lead to some people being more intolerant of emotional distress than others, right? So there is some suggestion that biologically, some people are more sensitive to negative emotions, experiencing negative emotions more easily and at a higher level of intensity and for longer duration. So this could be related to the way that you grew up, the environment that you were in when you were younger. It could be related to genetics and the way that your parents taught you how to deal with your emotions. If you were somebody who it was one of those situations where it was like, don't ask, don't tell, and we don't talk about those kind of things, then of course you learned to just shove them away, avoid them. And then again, it ends up building up, and then you have to release it in some way. Other people might have grown up with parents or in an environment where everything was very explosive and very chaotic. So you learned that emotions are big, emotions come out really strongly and intensely, and that's what you learned about emotions. So we can't always, we have to kind of look at the root causes, right? And kind of go back in our own histories and figure out, well, where did I learn this? Where did I learn about emotional distress, and how did this develop in me and for me? So because of this, it may mean that some people experience negative emotions as more painful, and they have greater difficulty coping with the experience. So if you are someone who's more primed to experiencing negative emotions, for whatever reason, you likely have a lot more trouble coping with the feelings and that overwhelm. So maybe you experienced growing up and through childhood and adolescence and through your adult life, these experiences that shape how you deal with your emotions. Some people have not been shown ways to tolerate emotional discomfort appropriately, like I said, through our parents or etc. And maybe they were even punished for expressing normal emotions like crying when they were sad when we were younger. So there's lots of ways that we can be shut down in our emotions, and be told that they're not okay. I think in society in general, we kind of follow that virtue of everything has to be good and everything has to be positive, and social media is just a highlight reel. But when in reality, it's normal to have human emotions. It's normal to feel sad. It's normal to feel angry. But it's how you cope with those things and how you deal with them that can sometimes tip it over to the unhelpful side, right? But the actual feeling itself it's just a feeling, right? It affects us, but it's how we react to it or how we respond to it that is the way that it tips it to an unhealthy or unhelpful way. Others, even through our parents, we might have been shown, or other family members, friends, whoever was influential for you in your life, might have been shown to deal with their emotions, like seeing a loved one use alcohol or drugs to deal with their emotions, right? And again, if we see that, then that's what we learn is how we cope. Some of us may have stumbled upon unhelpful ways of coping to escape our emotions, and these methods, again, they were reinforced in some way. The reason we keep doing them is because they were reinforced by temporarily making us feel better. So if you did something and you're like, oh, that felt really good in the moment, then of course you're going to keep doing it because it helped you in that moment to feel better. So it's reinforced. So that's why it becomes something that you do regularly, because it was reinforced. So this is why we keep using these unhelpful methods, and we don't tend to think there's a reason that we need to look for another way of dealing with our distress. So if this sounds like kind of a familiar attitude to you, then you may also perceive worrying to be useful to you as well. So some of us think that worrying is a way of preparing ourselves for the worst, of getting us ready for anything that might happen. It's a way, again, of anticipating for that uncertainty and planning ahead. So in other words, we keep worrying because we believe that it's our only strategy of making things in life more certain and more predictable. And it helps us believe that we have control. And I don't know if anyone can relate to that one. I'm sure we can. I think I've definitely had that in life where worrying I feel that worrying and by thinking ahead and really like planning helps me feel that things are going to be more certain, and it helps me believe that I have more control. But in reality, that's only a temporary solution, because typically things don't actually go the way that I've planned it out in my head. And then I'm left with that kind of, I'm still anxious when it actually happens to me, because I've been planning for a certain thing, because I've been worrying about it and I've been planning a certain way, and then it actually happens and it doesn't go the way that I thought it would. And then I'm just like, holy crap. And I still feel that anxiety. Worrying never stops us from feeling the anxiety that we're trying to avoid, but it feels helpful in the moment because planning ahead gives us a sense of control over that anxiety in the moment. So our worry, anger, distress, fear, and anxiety can be magnified by our irrational thoughts. So for example, the thoughts that something bad is going to happen, or if I do this new thing, I will fail, might lack evidence, but it still has a major impact on how we feel. And if we can learn to examine the evidence and challenge these thoughts, it might actually help us in avoiding getting caught up in those thoughts in the first place. So we are going to try and put our thoughts on trial. So I want everyone to choose a thought that has contributed to your fear, your worry, anxiety, or depression lately. And then I want us to think about the evidence that we have that can support this thought. So for example, if your thought is, if I try to play, if I try to play soccer, I'm going to fail, right? So the evidence to support that would be, one, I've never played soccer before, so I don't know how to do it. And again, only use verifiable facts. So you really want to be very conscious and clear about what facts you're using to support it. So no feelings or just kind of thoughts, but rather verifiable facts. So if I feel that I'm going to fail if I try to play soccer, then I can say, I've never played it before, so I don't know how it works. I don't know the rules. I don't know the footwork and everything involved. I could also say, I I'm not a super athletic person. I've never been part of sports before, so I struggle with sports, so I will probably fail at playing soccer. So again, we can probably find a lot of evidence that supports our maybe irrational thoughts or our thoughts that contribute to our worry. But you also have to find evidence that goes against that thought. So I could say, even if I've never been great at sports, maybe if I try, soccer might be my thing. I can go and practice, or I can ask a friend to help me to learn skills and to learn how to play soccer and learn the rules, right? So there are things that we can wait. That was probably not the best example, and I apologize for that. But there's definitely, it's helpful for us to pick out that thought that is really contributing to our worry. So maybe it's, I'm not good enough, I'm going to fail, yeah, I can only think of those two on the top of my head. But again, gathering, when you have that thought, when you figure out what that underlying thought that contributes to our worry is, or that even our depression or whatever, then you have to look at it and decide, okay, what things support this thought, and maybe what goes against that thought, and to really like put it on trial, write it down. It's almost like a pros and cons list, right? So how do I have evidence that supports this thought, and how do I have things that go against that thought? And it might be really challenging to actually to do this and actually work it through, but it might be really helpful as well to, as a strategy to overcome these thoughts. So when you compare the evidence that you come up with, you can actually determine if this thought is accurate or not. So this is, again, like a Socratic questioning method. So you're asking yourself, is this thought based on facts or feelings? How would my best friend see this situation? So maybe asking yourself some of these questions about some of the thoughts that we have might be helpful in counteracting them or preventing them from causing us more worry or more harm. How likely is it that my fear will come true? What's most likely to happen if this thing were to happen to me? And if my fears do come true, will it still matter in a week, in a month, in a year? So some of these questions, again, goes back to that idea of sometimes we have thoughts about things, and sometimes we have emotions about things, but they're often old patterns, or they're learned behaviors from other people and from our past. And we've never really challenged them or questioned them before. We've never been asked to reflect on these things. We've kind of just accepted them as the way that we are, and we don't really think about it beyond that. But when we actually sit down and challenge those things, and when we actually look at the evidence for or against it, or again, asking, I think a great question is asking, how would my best friend see this situation? How would they respond to it? What kind of things would they tell me? Because sometimes we are so critical of ourselves, but if our friend was to be in the same situation, we would be so supportive and so loving and so kind. So why can't we give that to ourselves? So some of these questions might be great to jot down, and just to have that in a note on your phone, just to be like, okay, if I'm upset about something, can I ask myself these questions, and can I try and use these as a way to mitigate my feelings? So when we think about it, and we think about our worry and our distress, in reality, it's like, well, has the worrying made anything more certain or more predictable? And again, in our thought process, yes, absolutely, it did in that moment, because you're like, okay, well, if this happens, then I can plan for this, right? So in that moment, it did. But by worrying or feeling that emotional distress, does it really change the outcome of what will happen? Can we really predict what is going to happen in the end? Isn't life still as uncertain and unpredictable as it ever was, even if we did spend 2 hours kind of in our head planning how something is going to go? So in fact, all we've really done when we work ourselves up and we're getting into that cycle is think of the worst case scenarios. We've worked ourselves up because we're thinking about the worst case scenario, and we've actually made ourselves feel really awful in the process. So again, even if you feel productive by being able to think ahead and plan for these things, in reality, again, we actually haven't done anything. It's just made us really, really stressed out in that moment. So again, is this process, is this kind of get stuck in that loop and worrying and planning ahead really helpful for you? And is it worth it to do those things and engage in that? Because in the end, has it really served you in any way? So does having that distorted sense of certainty that we get from worrying justify all the negative consequences of worrying? So if you answered no, then there are two main strategies that we can learn to help accept uncertainty and reduce worry. Absolutely. I really do agree that this is an easy thing to say, but it's a hard thing to practice. And again, just like with anything that we've learned over the last week and even today, it does require practice, and it does require us to be mindful, and it does require energy on our part, because this is not the way that our brain normally works, right? This goes against our kind of automatic thought process, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just requires more energy on your part. And if you don't have that day, then yeah, you know what? It's not the day to do it. But if you can overcome that and also push yourself a little outside of that window of tolerance, maybe, just to try it, you might be surprised at what you find. And again, it's going against that belief that we have that these coping strategies are that we've had over time and that we've never challenged are actually going to help us, when in reality they may not. Okay, so we're going to go over, like I said, some strategies that may help us accept uncertainty and reduce worry. So the way that we can learn to accept uncertainty and reduce our worry, again, like what we just talked about, is by challenging your intolerance of certainty and letting go of your intolerance of uncertainty, or accepting uncertainty. So challenging it, maybe by challenging our irrational thoughts in the way that we talked about before, but then also letting go of that need for certainty or our intolerance for uncertainty. So accepting the fact that everything in life is uncertain, and we really can't, as much as we want to plan, and we can plan ahead for certain things, and it's still good to plan. I'm not saying everyone should just decide to give up planning altogether and just go by the seat of your pants and do that. That's not always helpful. But at the same time, as much as we can plan, we also have to have an understanding and being okay with the fact that in the end, things might not go the way that we want them to, and that's okay. So by addressing your need for certainty, you're dealing with one of your positive beliefs about worry, which drives you to keep worrying. So by reducing your need for certainty, you will also reduce your drive to worry. So that might seem a little maybe different than you ever thought of it before. But when we accept uncertainty, when we allow for it in our lives, then we allow ourselves to stop worrying as much, because we know that no matter how much we worry about it, it's not going to change the outcome, right? We sometimes we can't choose the outcome. So when we spend time worrying about it, all we've done is waste our time worrying about it, rather than living our lives and being in the moment and enjoying our time and just being okay with whatever comes up for us when it comes up for us. So challenging our thoughts when they feel so overwhelming and so strong, and they feel stronger than ourselves sometimes, can be really hard. And again, sometimes, like we just went over, it's really helpful to ask ourselves those thought-provoking questions to help understand how our intolerance is helpful and unhelpful in our lives. So something that we can do is, I guess I have some questions that I want us to kind of go over. So do you tend to find yourself predicting that bad things will happen just because they're uncertain? Yes. And do you feel that this is a reasonable thing to do? No. So then what is the likelihood of positive or neutral outcomes happening, even if we predict that something bad is going to happen? So if we predict something bad, and because it's uncertain and we don't know what's going to happen, so we tend to go to that. We err on the side of, well, if I don't know what's going to happen, then it must be bad. But what is the likelihood that something actually good or maybe just neutral might come from it? And we're battling that worry. And again, we talked about a little bit how worry has actually become a positive thing for your life, right? We feel that by worrying, then we're able to predict, or we're able to control, right? So even if and so we have those positive feelings about it, we have a sense that helps us in some way. But then it also distracts us from being able to notice, that there may be positive outcomes from the things that we worry about. It's just as likely that something good happens from it as it is that it's something bad's going to happen from it. So another question, how likely is it that the things that you predict, so whether it be good or bad, will happen? 50-50, right? So there's always a chance that something bad will happen. There's always a chance that something good will happen. And there's always a chance that maybe something just very neutral might happen as well. So usually, and I can imagine maybe people can relate to this, is say we do predict something bad's going to happen. We spend so much time worrying about it. For example, a presentation that we're super nervous about, and we don't like getting up in front of a crowd. Maybe we've had a bad experience before. So again, that reinforces that negative thought process, and that maybe predicting the bad outcome. So when we predict that, okay, I'm going to get up there and I'm going to do so bad, I'm going to fail. But then when you get up there, it actually goes pretty well. Or even if you might not feel great about it, people are congratulating you and saying you did a great job and you get a great mark on the presentation, right? Like these are things that happen all the time when we even if we do predict bad things. So I guess maybe that question is it possible to live with the small chance that something negative may happen, given that the likelihood of it actually happening is really low? Hmm. Oh, I like that analogy. Worry is like a rocking chair. It keeps you busy, but but it never gets you anywhere. Yeah. It, right. It keeps your brain like on and kind of going, but it doesn't actually get us anywhere, and it doesn't serve us in any way. So can we live with some uncertainties of life, and how do we do this if we want to? How do we work ourselves into and practice the skill of being okay with some uncertainty in life? And can we do this in other situations that we might find difficult as well? These are just some questions to think about, and something that we can kind of ponder over the next little bit. So when we are emotionally distressed, your mind tends to focus on the future that's fueled with fear from the past. Okay, so we focus on what's going to happen moving forward. When we're distressed, we're again worrying about the future, planning ahead for things because of the fear that we've experienced in the past and that we've had bad experiences with. So an antidote to this style of thinking is to practice becoming more present focused and accepting your current experiences. So mindfulness, right? So any of the strategies that we talked about last time, this is going to help us mitigate some of these overwhelming feelings in the moment, because we're both on both spectrums, right? We're worrying about the future and we're distressed about it, but then we're also distressed about the fear of the things that we experienced in the past happening again. So we're always living on either spectrum, but we're never right here. We're never actually in the moment. So that's being in that moment and practicing those mindfulness skills and being more present can actually help us in being accepting of our current situations and accepting the fact that a little uncertainty, accepting that we may be uncertain, or accepting that, maybe what I'm thinking and I'm predicting is going to happen isn't actually going to happen, and it might actually turn out okay. So letting go of our need for certainty, and accepting that uncertainty is an inevitable part of life, is easier said than done, for sure. And when we find ourselves demanding certainty and predictability and lack that flexibility and tolerance for uncertainty and change, our attention, like we just talked about, is very future focused, and our mind is worrying in attempts to gain certainty and control. So the following, I just want to address before I move on, that would mindfulness practice over time bring us to think more positively? Um, I'm hesitant to say yes or no on that one. I think what mindfulness practice does for us is, again, it just brings us into the present moment, and maybe it does turn into thinking more positively, but I think what it does is it just prevents us from getting stuck in those overwhelming kind of unhelpful thinking styles that maybe bring us to feeling more negative. So I think it will change your thinking, and it will change how you feel in a more positive direction. But I'm hesitant to say whether it'll have us thinking more positively all the time. But I think it will help in diminishing or decreasing the amount of kind of negative affect we feel, and those negative cycles of thought that we feel. So the following 5-step process can really help us address our need for certainty. So the first step we have is recognizing or acknowledging when you are feeling the need for certainty and wanting to use worry to achieve this. So really be aware of the fact that when you get stuck in that loop, and when you're feeling that need, like, oh, I'm not sure how this is going to happen. I don't know how this next situation is going to go. So you're searching for certainty, and you're using worry to achieve that, to achieve decreasing your anxiety about the future. So then you go on to make an active choice to not respond to that need for certainty. And instead you decide, I'm going to let go, and I'm going to accept uncertainty, and turning your attention to being more present focused rather than future focused. Okay. So your next step is, after you're aware of it and you acknowledge it, it's so that you don't react, right? We talked about reacting versus responding. So taking that pause to really think, okay, I need to let go. I need to accept that there may be some uncertainty in the situation that I'm going to feel, and to decide to change my attention focus, redirect my attention to the present rather than being on the future. So being more present focused can help bring about an acceptance of uncertainty. And if you're focused on the present rather than the future, then uncertainty about the future is less likely to bother you, because you're not spending time worrying and anticipating it. You're actually just living your life in the present moment. So obviously our minds are going to drift back and forth between wanting certainty and control in life. But again, just keep repeating the steps of being aware, not responding, letting go, and letting go of the need for certainty, and becoming more present focused, right? So the more we're able to be aware of our worry and be aware of that cycle that we get in, the more that we can stop that, the more that we can learn to let go of it, allow for some uncertainty, and redirect our attention to a mindfulness strategy or to being more in the present. So another helpful strategy, or another set of steps, again, is being aware of what you're currently thinking and what you are feeling, and use in your body, and use the feelings of your breath to remain present. So what are you noticing when you're feeling the need to have certainty? So acknowledge these thoughts and feelings, and maybe saying, okay, so this is just how it is, right? So if you can learn to talk yourself down, and again, becoming aware of it, acknowledging what we're thinking, what we're feeling, really notice how that's affecting our bodies and our minds. And then again, using our breath, using a mindfulness strategy to stay in the present, and to just acknowledge it and just sit with it for a minute. Then we can learn to let go of it. So we need the letting go of that need for a quick fix. So by saying something that can help let go of the uncertainty. So maybe it's only a need for certainty. Just let it go, right? So by acknowledging what that thought is, and maybe why we're feeling the way that we're feeling, and saying, okay, well, I'm just seeking certainty. I'm feeling uncertain about things. I'm feeling really worried about the future, what's going to happen. I'm just seeking certainty. And that's why I'm doing X, Y, Z. So if you can acknowledge where it is, you're able to let go of it. So next part is being non-judgmental. So by being gentle with yourself and being curious about your thoughts, rather than judging yourself or shutting yourself down, you can allow them to happen without judging them or trying to change them. Then you can return your focus to the present and your current experiences, and focus your attention fully on maybe the sounds that you're hearing, the sensations in your body, your breath, or the task at hand. Right? So by being non-judgmental, and by, again, allowing our feelings when we tend to not allow our feelings, and to not judge ourselves for feeling that way, and for saying, I feel angry right now. I don't like when I feel angry, but it's okay that I feel angry because angry is a normal human emotion that everyone feels. I just have to, right now, I have to pause. I have to breathe, whatever exercise you feel works best for you. And just take a minute to pause and just be aware of it, acknowledge it, let it go. And acknowledge the fact that, you know, you're a human being, you're going to have feelings, and that's okay. But then you bring yourself back into the present and notice what's going on and be able to stay with that present moment and stay and activate those strategies that we've been talking about. Okay. So I know we've talked a lot about unhelpful coping strategies today and maybe overwhelming feelings, but I just wanted to kind of end on some healthy coping strategies. And a lot of us probably always already use these things, and maybe we didn't notice that they were helpful coping strategies or healthy coping strategies. But I just want to touch on these things because, again, sometimes it's helpful to end on a more positive note. So things like exercise, talking about your problems with somebody that you trust or somebody that you feel comfortable with, healthy eating, seeking professional help. Whoops, sorry about that. Relaxation techniques. So like all the things we talked about before, like deep breathing, mindfulness, meditation, all those things. So using social support is really good. So again, talking about that problem with someone you feel really comfortable with, seeking out the help or the love and support of your family or friends or anybody who is really close to you in your life. And then also using some problem-solving techniques. So similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of challenging our irrational thoughts or kind of going through a step-by-step process in terms of trying to let go. Being mindful, action verb. To be happy-minded by preventing such avoiding being blinded. I like that. So I guess I'm curious, does anyone else have any other helpful, like healthy coping strategies that aren't on this list that they feel that they use that might be helpful for others to know? So maybe I know a lot of us have talked about going for a walk. That's a great one. Using any form of creativity. So whether that be music, art, dance, anything like that, that's another one. Journaling. Awesome. Yes, that's definitely a healthy coping strategy. Thank you for bringing that one up. Does anyone else have any healthy coping strategies that they feel like they use? So thank you for bringing up the idea of what's in your control and what's out of your control. So in our workbook this week, for week 2, it's all about kind of being able to tolerate that uncertainty. And we also included a locus of control workbook. So again, that's going to help us really examine our need for control and how to maybe work through that and develop strategies to like help us not feel that intense need all the time. So that might be a really helpful this week's workbook. It might be really helpful in addressing that. Ooh, therapeutic coloring, awesome. Hot bath, reading, taking time to laugh. Absolutely. These are great, great strategies. Thank you for sharing. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to ask. I can kind of spend the next couple minutes just taking questions if anyone has any questions. But other than that, thank you so much for being here today. As always, I really appreciate you showing up and being here and participating. And I hope that you took something away from this. And I will see you next week for week 3. And I hope to see you all again.